The first thing I want to do is remove my battery. I'm going to start with the negative terminal. Loosen that up. Take that connector off. Remove the positive. Take that connector off and then loosen up these two hooks. And this one can slide out. And then remove this one as well. And remove your battery. This will give you a lot more access to work. Right in here, there's a 12mm bolt. Go ahead and remove that. There's another 12mm bolt right in here. Remove that one too and hold the shield. Now you can let it drop down and unhook it from the front. Slide it forward. There we go. Now with the shield off from underneath, it's easier from here to remove the belt. I'm going to take it off the alternator and the AC pulley and release tension. I used this tool on purpose because I can leave it here for now and come back to get it later. I'm going to unplug the alternator from right here. The tab to unlock it is on the back side. Press it and wiggle the connector off. And at this point, I already have my battery unplugged and removed. You don't have to remove it, but you do have to disconnect it. And with a 10mm, I'm going to remove this little nut that holds on the main alternator power wire. Remove that and disconnect the wire. Set that aside. And I'm going to actually put the nut back on. That way I don't lose it. Now with a 12mm, I'm going to remove this bolt here. Okay, I'm going to remove this bolt completely. Now with a 14, I'm actually going to remove this idler pulley. That'll make it easier for me to take the alternator out. I'm going to remove this 14mm bolt that holds the alternator on the bottom. I'm going to remove that bolt completely. There it is. Now if I wiggle the alternator, it should come right off. Perfect. And I'm going to try and slide it up and out. I'm going to put a pry bar in here and very gently remove tension off of the tensioner. That's going to allow me to get my socket off of here. And then the pry bar can slide right off. And now with a 12mm, I'm going to remove these two bolts. And before I go underneath, I also want to remove that 14mm bolt there. All right, remove that. All right, now let's go underneath and remove some more bolts down there. From underneath, I'm going to remove my two last compressor bolts. And now with this one out of here, there's one more behind it. All right, I switched to my air ratchet so I can take this out easily. Come on. Now this bolt can come off. Now you can take the AC compressor, push it forward, and if you just lift it up a little bit, you can get to the bolts that are behind there for the serpentine belt tensioner. If you unbolt this line, the compressor will actually be able to slide up and out of your way. Now you can take it and lift it up. I'm going to use a pry bar just to pry it up and hold it there. With a 14mm, I'm going to remove all these bolts here. Nice. And there's the fourth one. At this point, you can remove the serpentine belt tensioner and just try to wiggle it out. And there's your old serpentine belt tensioner. I'm going to take my new tensioner and just try to slide it in. Now you can line up the new tensioner, take one of the bolts. I'm going to choose this one up here because it's the easiest one to reach and try to start it on. The last one for me is going to be that top one all the way in the back. I'm going to snug up the bolts, bottom them out, and then once they are bottomed out with the small ratchet, I'm going to take my long ratchet and make sure that they really are nice and tight. There's no way I can torque this, so I'm This is the best I can do, is to just make sure they're really tight. Now with my longer ratchet, I'm going to tighten these up as tight as I can. There we go. Okay, that's the front two. And do the same to the other two. With my AC compressor lined up, I'm gonna start in these two bottom bolts and thread them on. Now that one's started, and start in the back one too. All right, start in the rear one as well. And let's snug them up. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and snug up this rear one first. Make sure the threads don't cross thread. Go ahead and tighten up these. It's impossible to get a torque wrench in here, so I'm going to do the best I can by hand and snug it up. You want to make sure that these are tight so that they don't come loose by themselves. All right, that's tight. Now let's do the front one. All right, that's nice and tight. Let's go up top. I'm going to start the top bolts now. One over here, one over here. I'm going to snug them all up. All right, let's snug them up by hand now. Now I'm gonna take my ratchet and double check them by hand. Make sure they're nice and tight. I'm gonna put one more bolt in here for the serpentine belt tensioner, and this is easily confused with the alternator bolt that goes through here. Just remember that this one for the alternator is actually a little bit longer than this one. This slightly shorter one goes into that hole and gets tightened up. All right, let's double check it by hand. I'm gonna put my long ratchet on here and just double check that it's nice and tight. Now before you install your alternator, this sleeve right here can actually get pushed out just a little bit, and that's going to make it a whole lot easier for installation, because when you slide this onto the bracket here, if you push the sleeve out, it'll give you more wiggle room and you won't have to basically hammer it on, which is not a good idea to do. Now let's get this on. This is going to go down there like this. The bracket right there, back there, will slide in between the two little arms of the alternator, and that's where you want that sleeve to be pushed out. If it's not pushed out, you'll kind of struggle putting it in. All right, the bolt is in. It's not always easy to line up that part, but with some wiggling and prying and very, very light hammering. If you do have to hammer, use a rubber mallet, not a steel hammer, because you can crack the casing of the alternator if you use a steel hammer, and then, well, you're in trouble. The bottom one isn't 100% in yet, but I'm hoping that having this one in will help me line up the bottom one better. I'm going to thread it on. I won't tighten it because I need this alternator to still be able to pivot, but I'm hoping that this will give it a steady pivot point for the bottom to line up. So now I can shake it back and forth a little and basically try to move that bottom bolt into position. Now I'm going to make sure that it's actually tight by hand. Okay, I'm going to hold the nut on this one and tighten it up. All right, that's nice and tight. Let's connect the wire back to the alternator. I'm going to reconnect the connector over here. Make sure that's secure. I'm going to remove the nut that I replaced on there. Make sure this connection is clean and not rusty or corroded. Put that back on. Make sure it's seated fully. And let's tighten up this nut. Now be careful with this when you tighten it. You don't want to make it very tight because the stud that it tightens on is actually brass. So you can easily break it inside the alternator. So just give it, once it bottoms out, maybe like an 1/8 to 1/4 of a turn at most. And that's good right there. Let's put on the cap. Go ahead and put on this cap. Press it on. And put back any wiring that was disconnected. I'm going to reinstall my idler up on the top here. Okay, line it up and start the bolt in. And then tighten it to 29 foot-pounds. Okay, let's tighten that. Perfect. To put the belt on, I'm going to go, it's on the water pump already, so I'm going to go underneath this top idler and up and around the alternator. I'm going to bring it down under the AC pulley, over this bottom idler, and over the harmonic balancer. So it has to go all the way around and then up and over, and again underneath the water pump. Oh, but also over that idler over there. So kind of like that. Now you can get your tool, your ratchet, stick it on here, pull the tensioner to remove tension, slip the belt on. Make sure it's seated properly everywhere. There we go. So now it's on. I'm going to double check all the pulleys, make sure that it's sitting properly. It's on. Oh, it's not fully on the power steering. So I'm going to push it on to make sure it's on all the ribs. It's very important because otherwise once you start the engine, your belt is just going to get shredded. That's fully engaged right there. Perfect. Alternator's good. AC is good. So I'm going to remove my tool. And when I start my car, after like 2 or 3 seconds of it running, I'm going to shut it off and come double check my belt. Put up your shield. It gets hooked onto the front here with the 2 hooks. One's ready to fall apart. That's okay. And you can slide it up, start in your 2 bolts. That's one. Snug them up. I'm going to reinstall my battery now, and before I connect it, I'm going to put on this hook here for the retainer for the battery. It hooks in at the back, and then slide it over, put the front hook on, and connect that at the bottom, snug it up. Put your handle down, connect your positive terminal. Make sure that's nice and tight. Then connect your negative and make sure that's nice and tight. Now take your car for a road test.